Thank you, Allison. This is Shannon again. I just wanted to draw your attention to a couple questions that came in the chat, if that's okay.
Sure.
First from Elijah. Elijah asks, what if I don't have a story that's particularly funny? Is there still a good way to appeal to the interview panel on a personal level?
Oh, that's a really good question, and I guess I wasn't clear. I'm not funny. It's not about funny, right? It's about like crafting the arc of what you did. Instead of somebody saying like, "How have you ever used this one specific technology or tool?" Right? Think about how you craft that in terms of, yes, I used this tool when I taught some grandmother how to write their resume on, Microsoft, that kind of thing. Like, you don't want to just say, I've just worked with Microsoft Word. You want to be able to tell about a time you actually did that in detail. And funny is cool. I think warm is more important, right? Always centering how much you care about people, because this is a people business. It's not really an information business. Just make sure that you aren't just like, yeah, I've done these things, or I have this experience. It's really thinking about how that connects.
Great, thank you, Allison. Another question from Jennifer. How do we feel about taking notes or having notes during a phone interview or in person?
Personally, I'm sure we would love to hear lots of people's experience on this, but personally, I think it is essential, right? Especially if you're presenting before a committee, you want to be able to keep everybody's name straight and be able to refer back to it, especially as the phone interview is just one stage of the process. You want to know who you're talking to and when. So I think that that's a wonderful thing to do.
Excellent. I will also add to that. You're like, there's probably a lot of opinions. I will say, I also think it's essential to take notes. And I also think that it's essential to write down a lot of the things that you talked about in your preparation, because not only do you have that in front of you to refer to, but just the act of writing it down solidifies it in your mind. So note taking throughout the entire application process is super important. So I totally agree with you there. Another question from Jeannie. For those of us right out of library school, how much emphasis on school projects versus real world experience?
So it's funny, right? In librarianship, we say things like, "Oh, I'm brand new to the field," even though, I worked in public libraries for a while, or I was in academic services. I think everything you've done in school is relevant, right? Talking about, these are the things I care about. You can even frame it like, I have done a ton of work around this topic. I've done a lot of research about this topic. I've done a lot of reading about this topic. Whatever makes you feel the most comfortable. I know that I had done a ton of writing about OERs during graduate school, and very quickly at my new job, I had a colleague like, "Oh, you've done all this OER work. Help me write this grant proposal." And so that was a really easy way to translate those skills. And I do find in librarianship, everybody's like super kind about being just out of school. Like, we all went to school for a reason, right? The school should be preparing you for the workplace. So as long as we all acknowledge that, I think that's key. And I think it's really helpful.
Great, thank you. And Jennifer, who had the note-taking question, said thank you in the chat. So I wanted you to get that feedback, Allison.
Thank you.
Also Ariana C put in the chat, notes are helpful for thank you notes to send after the interview as well. So that's another important thing to close that communication circle.
Absolutely.
Or keep it open, actually. And then Hannah asked, what would you say is the biggest difference between interviews based on the institution, like public library interviews versus academic library interviews or others?
Okay. I haven't interviewed for others. I have interviewed for both public and academic. And I would say in public libraries, the focus is almost 100% on people, right? How do you deal with a stressful situation? How do you speak to people? How do you get along with your coworkers? Sometimes, the anti-racist questions, diversity and inclusion, those things. But in my experience, public librarianship is 100% people oriented with, like, how would you answer this reader's advisory question or help with this one specific skill set for someone. So think about those things, but always bring it back to people. I was actually lucky enough to get hired as a part-time public librarian before I started library school with 0 library experience. And the feedback I got, because I was like, why did you take this chance on me as a part-time librarian? And they said it was because it was clear you cared about people and you were willing to put yourself out there and connect with the public. So that was my experience with that and my experience when I was sitting on the other side of that table. Um, and academic libraries absolutely speak to how you care about people. But I will say the interviews are a lot longer. There's usually a subject area or a specific skill set that you're going to focus on, right? Whether that's instruction in terms of you have your subject specialist, or cataloging. So there's going to be more specific questions along those lines. Sometimes there's theoretical questions, right? Like, what is your teaching philosophy? What is your service philosophy? And then it's a lot of like specific skills and maybe even a teaching demo. So it's, it's a whole other can of worms, but they're both, incredibly rewarding. It's just a matter of knowing what you're walking into. And that's where that research ahead of time will be key.
Yes, and a comment from Tanya in the chat. She points out, and you mentioned the teaching presentation. So what Tanya says is academic library interviews will typically require you to deliver a presentation based on a question from the interview committee. And that has been my experience as well. And she says that this is less common for public library interviews.
I have seen things like a story time demos and things for especially like a children's librarian positions.
Ah, that's really interesting. A lot of the questions that came in when we asked everyone to register, we asked what some of their questions were. And so I am armed with those since the chat has slowed down just a little bit. So I'm going to address, we had quite a few around the idea that now that we're all remote, that these may actually be video rather than phone call interviews. And we did put a link to a couple resources in the chat for people, but I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
So thoughts on that are, do as much as you can to control. I think I touched on this briefly, like this is my clothes rack with a curtain kind of thing. Think about your background. People kind of judge that one way or another. So I try to keep it neutral. This is what I use when I'm teaching or recording instructional videos or things like that too. Practice what you look like on camera. Think about, I wasn't sure if this busy print was going to work or not, and I wouldn't wear this for an interview, right? But it's hot and I don't have air conditioning. And just really control what you look like and get used to it. I do think a headset and a microphone make a huge difference, and that can just be, earbuds or whatever works for you. This just works for me. And then get used to like looking away from the camera. I do find Zoom interviews the most exhausting if you're staring directly at the screen and everybody's face as much as possible. That can just be really impossible to sustain. So, and then get used to like looking at yourself on the screen too, if it's going to be a setting that you see yourself in that corner. Make sure that's not the first time that you're like confronted with your own image as you're speaking, because that's a unique thing.
Great, thank you. And we do have another question in the chat. So Allison, this is from Laura. Do you have any special tips for the thank you email?
Yeah, that's another one of those where I listen for context clues, right? I remember when I sent a thank you email, one of the go-rounds, I was very much like, oh, I can't wait to hear more about this project that you're doing. That sounds really exciting. If you think about anything that you can hear or learn during those interviews, being able to touch on that very specifically, I think can make a huge difference. And talk about, and if you don't have that much detail from someone, just talk about how excited you are about something about the institution or the library. I also personally think that thank you emails make the most sense after the in-person. I don't know that they go in that in-between between the phone and the in-person interview, but I do think being as specific as possible and not just like, thank you for your time, it was nice to meet you, goes a long way, just like everything else.
And Allison, I'll give if you don't mind, I'll give a perspective on the thank yous between the phone and the in-person. As someone who has interviewed, I've always sent an email after each point in the interview to remind them of my interest, except in one case, actually the job that I have right now, they got back to me more quickly than I turned around to the thank yous. And so so I didn't have a chance, but I sent thank yous immediately once I knew I had the in-person to let them know how much I appreciated it and how interested I still was. So
it's interesting.
Yeah,
I've been at places where we were basically discouraged from even opening the emails from candidates in the interview process. So
Yeah, and it really depends on
mhm.
the organization you're interviewing at, because I can also say, as somebody who's served on multiple search committees, all academic, I should say, that the thank yous are nice, but not as influential, but they are really helpful for us knowing a candidate is still interested. So I think that that's one of the most important things about the thank you, is like letting them know how much you want it. Another question that I will bring from the questions we got ahead of time. Somebody had a question about how to talk about why you left a job. Do you have any advice about that?
So generally, I think it's a better idea to always be forward looking, right? Just talk about what you're excited about at this new job, or, you know, if you left one job, took another, just be like, oh, well, this next move made the most sense for me. I was most excited about XYZ. I it's almost never a good idea to talk about negative things unless, you know, you're just like, well, this isn't the right fit for me. You know, I remember when I was in public libraries, I stay at home mom. I have 4 small children under the age of 8, and they'd always be like, oh, could you do the story time? And I'd be like, no, I go home to my kids. I don't want to do that here. So I could imagine, you know, if they had asked, like when I was thinking about going for adult librarian jobs, I'd be like, no, I'm really excited to work with adults. So if I'd been put in a children's role, I would have just been like, oh, well, children wasn't right for me. So you could speak along something along those lines, like, or I wasn't that interested in cataloging. I'm really excited about instruction, or vice versa. So you could think about like the theories, the ideas behind why that maybe wasn't the right fit for you and why the new role is the right fit for you. And then just really focus on what you're excited about at the new job.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Some more activity in the chat. So I just want to point out that Tanya put a link to a book in the chat. She says, our students have found this book to be helpful in preparing for interviews. So that link is there in the chat. And Sarah has let us know that she has sent emails and paper cards after each interview. And then a question from Ariana. What can set you apart from other candidates?
I
That's
think
a really general question.
yeah. Yeah, so I think that was kind of what I was trying to touch on my presentation, right? Like, what will set you apart is not necessarily whether you can check all the boxes, right? The market is really competitive right now, and there's going to be a lot of people that can check all the boxes. But what kind of compelling story, relevant information can you bring to this? How can you explain how your previous customer service experience is directly relevant to the public library experience or the academic library experience or helping patrons? How do you explain how your writing tutoring experience can translate this way? Because not only does that demonstrate your skill set, but it also demonstrates your understanding of the new job, right? If you can connect with that new job in very specific ways, having been on both sides of this interview, that will go a lot further than just like, well, it's all on my resume. Look, I've done all the things, and being very like general and I just check the boxes.